Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Flux, back again. More homebrew beer, more homebrew beats. Anyway, figured I'd do a short video just kind of talking about drums and not necessarily how to process them, but techniques to get them where you want them to be without intensive processing. Some old school techniques, basically. I talked to some friends not that long ago about. They were asking me about the old school way of getting drums to be gritty and to smack and to have a more thunderous approach. And there seems to be some confusion as to overdrive and how to get a sample to sound gritty without making it sound distorted. And it seems like there's some common knowledge on the internet where people talk about, oh well, if you record your drums at a really high level, you're going to get better drum sounds, more gritty drums. And while that can be true in some cases, for the majority of us users, that's not really the case, and it's major misinformation. So what I wanted to do is just kind of talk about when that's appropriate and when it's really not. Now, of course, as with any rule in music and in audio, there's always times to break rules and make your own rules and deal with things how you want to deal with them. But when it comes to clipping and overdrive and distortion and grit, there's a few things that kind of need to be understood before you can go breaking rules. One of those things that you should understand is digital clipping is not the same as analog clipping. Analog clipping can produce certain harmonics in your waveform that are pleasant to the ear. Digital clipping really does not do this. Above 0 dB in analog, to an extent, you can get some fuzz on the waveform. Okay, and what that means is you're adding harmonics, harmonic distortion. This is the method that guitar players use to get overdrive on their guitars. Distortion on guitars is a desirable effect because you're adding in harmonics that work with the sound. Okay, now if you were using just straight digital clipping, distortion as a whole may have never been utilized, or if it was, it certainly wouldn't be done in the same amount and way that we use it today. Digital clipping, there's nothing above 0, period. In the digital world, there is no above 0. Okay, if you go above 0, your waveform is just sharply cut off. Okay, and when that happens, you get digital clipping, and digital clipping does not produce good harmonics to your sound. It doesn't add any warmth to your sound. It doesn't add any nice, pleasant fuzz. It adds a harsh crackle or just a very ugly, harsh sound. It's not to say that you can't use digital clipping, for sound design purposes, but for the majority of us, if your waveforms are digitally clipping and they look like a brick wall, meaning that there's no up and down, it just looks like straight lines across it. Line, straight, it looks like a square wave, basically. That's not a good thing. Now, where a lot of the confusion comes in is, oh, well, if I've got an MPC, I like to drive my samples a little bit harder when they come in. Different people feel different ways about that. I'm not a big fan of doing it that way. I know some people are. I've done it. When you do that, you don't want to go overboard with it. If you're overdriving your samples into your digital sampler like an MPC is digital. Okay, same with any ASRX, all that stuff, digital. Okay, it's not utilizing an analog chip to to reproduce a sound, it's going in digitally, okay? But what can happen there is if you're clipping just a little bit, you can get this grit by overdriving your inputs a little bit. And the analog inputs can tend to work with that a little bit. But realistically, if you're overdriving in that way, you want something like tubes or tape. Those are the real ways to get, quality harmonics added into your sound. When you're using a sampler and you want to get more grit, the ways that you can go about that are really not difficult at all these days. And they came about from ways that were really out of necessity. Okay, we were doing things like we were sampling our vinyl and speeding it up. I was even using cassette tapes and speeding up cassette tapes to do it. But it didn't really matter the source so much as you were speeding it up just to save time. And then as you slowed it down, because of the lower bit and sample rates, you were basically breaking apart the sample a little bit. And depending on the quality of the audio engine in whatever particular piece of hardware, be it an ASR, be it an SP, be it an MPC, doesn't matter. You know what I mean? They're just names. It's hardware. Okay? And as you were slowing it down, the quality wasn't there. It wasn't like it's like an HD picture, okay? This was using an SD picture. Nowadays we have an HD picture. So our sound is much finer. We can do a lot more with it before we get that grit. So you see things like Machine has the SP12 and MPC modes in it that emulate these older sample and bit rates and emulate how the circuits would react when you would slow samples down. So if you're going to gritty up a drum, what you would have to do is you would have to first have the sample at a higher pitch than what you want it to be, and then pitch it down so that it's slowing apart and so that you're breaking it apart in the same way you would hardware. That's how the vintage mode in Machine works. It works just like the hardware did back then because they're emulating the actual hardware. It's not just an effect to throw on top like a bit crusher or a bit reducer is. It's an actual emulation of the hardware. With that being said, there's also other things like Decimort. I love Decimort. I think it's great. I don't always think it sounds true to how the old machines sounded, but that doesn't matter. What matters is how the sound ends up coming out. And I play with that a little bit. I've got, some guitar pedals that I'll run stuff through. And I've got an old tube amp that I'll run things through. But if you're gonna be clipping your samples, make sure you're going through an analog source clipping. And then when you get to the digital domain, make sure that it's not clipping in the digital domain is basically the point. If you want to overdrive something into Machine, I'd recommend running it through an analog preamp first. And then have a quality, pristine sample in Machine or your DAW, FL, whatever you're using. It really doesn't matter. I always reference back to Machine because it's what I use the most often. So you can run through a mixer, run through analog, an analog mixer. A lot of times I'll run things to like tape. Anything that is going to be able to give you quality harmonics to go along with your sound as opposed to just a digitally clipped sample. You're not going to get the same effect nowadays just driving things hard as you would back then. So that's basically what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to explain, kind of how digital clipping is going to affect your sound versus how something like an analog sound source is going to go. You can actually pick up, like Art makes these really cheap tube preamps. You can pick one of those up and drive through one of those really hard. And then just set your input levels low. And you've got this, harmonically distorted. Granted, they're not the most pristine sound, but that's not really what you're going for when you're doing that. You're going for something gritty. So, you don't need expensive gear in order to get those sorts of sounds. Nowadays, some of the top of the line stuff from like 1998 is dirt cheap now. You know what I mean? So you can get these pieces of gear pretty cheap, to be able to obtain effects that you're looking for. Also, like I said, guitar pedals, tube guitar pedals. Set the distortion and everything way low, or even off, and then you could just drive into that. When you do that, a lot of times you're better off with, attenuation, but if you don't know what that is, Wikipedia, because your signal's going to be higher, but don't worry about that. Anyway, point being, before you go clipping everything out, if you look at your waveforms and they look like a brick wall, or like a square wave, and it's supposed to be an analog source, meaning like a record or a sample that you're using, whatever, even if it's something from YouTube, chances are it probably isn't going to sound so great, unless you're going for some kind of broke up sound. You know what I mean? And that's cool too. Do whatever you want to do. But warm, gritty sound, realistically, nowadays, you want to have that sample in your computer without it clipping. You want to do that kind of processing before it ever gets there, or as an after effect, not going directly in. You don't want your raw sample to be busted. That's all I'm here to say. Now, I'm going to get back to some beer, and if you want videos on anything, let me know. I know some guys want me to do a full beat video from scratch, and I've done it on Ustream before, but I don't like the hey, I did this beat in 15 minutes attitude. I think if you did that beat in 15 minutes, you should have spent another hour and came up with something better, because if you're that good at 15 minutes, I wonder how good you'd be at an hour, right? So videos like that would require editing, and I'd rather be making music than making videos. So anyway, hit me up at Flux302. And if you got any questions, you can either ask me or you can look it up and read. Reading never killed anybody. Unless it was some crazy propaganda and then the people came after you. I know some people get crazy with that. You never know. Egyptian statues on Mars. Just saying. Careful. Peace.